My brother pointed at me and snapped, "Confess before this gets worse." After accusing me of emptying our parents' savings, I smiled and said, "Go ahead, make the call." Then the evidence turned the investigation straight back on him. The first time my brother accused me of stealing from our parents, I honestly thought he had lost his mind. It was a Sunday afternoon in late March, and I was standing in my parents' kitchen in suburban Ohio with a paper plate of leftover ham and potato salad, trying to ignore the fact that my mother was pretending not to listen while my father stared at the TV with the volume too low to cover anything. My brother, Eric, had cornered me by the sink like we were in some bad movie. He was red in the face, jabbing a finger at my chest, acting like he had already solved the whole thing. He told me that if I had emptied our parents' savings, I should confess before it got worse. I remember looking at him and feeling this weird calm settle over me because I knew exactly what he was talking about, or at least I thought I did. I had not emptied anybody's savings. I had not even touched the account. What I had done over the previous 6 months was notice that something was very wrong and start saving every statement, every receipt, every strange voicemail, and every odd little mistake that seemed too small to matter. At the time, I still did not know who was actually behind it. I only knew that it was not me. And when Eric told me to confess, I told him to go ahead and make the call. That was the moment he made his first real mistake. The issue started small enough that I almost ignored it. My parents were in their 70s, still living in the same split-level house in Dayton they had bought in the 1980s. My dad had always handled the bills, and my mom had always handled the kitchen, the church calendar, and the kind of family bookkeeping that lived in her head instead of on paper. They were the kind of people who trusted the same bank for 30 years because changing banks felt like unnecessary trouble. They had a savings account they called the emergency fund, and then they had a checking account where their Social Security deposits and pension payments went. Nothing glamorous, nothing hidden, just the sort of money system a lot of older couples in the U.S. have when they never got comfortable with online banking. I lived about 40 minutes away with my wife and our daughter, and I was the one who ended up doing the practical things, fixing the garbage disposal, driving my dad to a cardiology appointment, setting up new phones, helping them log into email after some update locked them out. Eric lived only 15 minutes from them, but he was always busy in some vague, untouchable way. He had bounced around between sales jobs for years, usually with some explanation about commissions, market shifts, or management not appreciating him. He was the older brother, which in our family had somehow evolved into a permanent expectation that everybody else would make room for him. Our parents excused a lot from him because he was charming when he wanted to be. He could walk into a room and make my mother laugh in 5 seconds. He could also make promises and then forget them without ever seeming ashamed. I had always been the reliable one, which meant I was the one people called when something needed to be fixed. I did not mind that role until it started turning into suspicion. The first thing I noticed was a text from my mom asking me to check the checking account because she thought one of the utility payments had bounced. That was unusual. She never checked the account herself. She just asked my dad if there was enough in there, and he would say yes or no. When I asked her what she meant, she said the water bill had been late and that the bank statement looked thinner than it should have. I figured maybe my dad had paid a large bill or moved money. When I went over the next day, I sat with him at the kitchen table and looked through the statements he kept in a plastic folder with coupons and old property tax notices. He handed them to me with no concern at all. That was what made me uneasy. There was no panic in him, just a tired little shrug. A few withdrawals from the savings account looked odd. Not huge, not at first. A couple thousand here, a couple thousand there. Transfers into checking, then cash withdrawals from an ATM near a grocery store on the other side of town. I asked my dad if he had taken the cash out. He said no. He said he hardly ever used cash anymore. He told me maybe the bank had made a mistake. I remember the way he said it, half embarrassed, like he was annoyed at himself for not keeping better track. I told him I would call the bank with him. He agreed, but then he got distracted by the mail and told me to come back later because he wanted to finish watching a baseball game. That should have been the point where I got alarmed. Instead, I wrote the dates down, took photos of the statements with my phone, and thought I was being careful. At first, I still assumed it was a glitch or maybe identity theft from outside the family. I had seen enough stories about seniors being targeted by scammers to know that was possible. But the timeline kept getting weirder. The withdrawals were clustered around days when Eric had come by. One was after he had taken my father to a lunch appointment he insisted on covering. Another was after he had helped my mother reset her email password. Another was after he had said he was going to stop by to check their furnace filter. Nothing conclusive, just enough to make the back of my neck itch. When I asked my parents about Eric helping them with things, my mother got defensive in that tired, irritated way she did when she did not want family tension. She said Eric had been trying hard lately. She said he was under pressure. She said he was helping because he cared. I asked what kind of pressure. She waved it off. She said everyone had things going on. At the time, I accepted that answer because my mother had a lifetime of defending the people she loved, even when she had no business doing it. I wish I could say I immediately saw what was happening. I did not. I saw pieces. I saw enough to feel uneasy. That is not the same thing. The next month, my dad mentioned a new credit card debt he did not recognize. That got my attention. It turned out he had received a letter from a collections company about a card in his name with a balance just under $9,000. He swore he had never opened it. I asked to see the letter. It was legit. Not a scam email or a fake call, an actual mailed notice. The kind that makes your stomach drop because it is printed on paper and has your name on it. I spent an evening on the phone with the card issuer and then with my father's bank, trying to understand whether this was fraud or just a clerical mix-up. The card company told me the account had been opened online, tied to my father's information, and used for groceries, gas, a hardware store, and some cash advances. The bank told me the transfers from savings had been authorized from inside online banking. That should have been impossible. My dad barely knew how to answer a text. He had no idea how to access online banking. I sat at his desk with his old laptop and realized the problem was not that the bank had been careless. Someone had access, someone who knew enough to set things up and enough to make it look normal. I asked my parents who had helped them with their computer lately. My mother said Eric had been over several times, mostly because my dad liked having help with the printer and the banking website. My father admitted Eric had logged in for them once or twice when their password stopped working. He said Eric had been trying to simplify things. He said it was easier than waiting for me to come by, and that Eric lived closer anyway. I could feel my jaw tightening. Eric had never once called to ask my opinion before helping them with sensitive financial stuff. He had just stepped in and presented it as a favor. That was the first time I seriously wondered whether he was the one taking the money. Still, I did not accuse him. I did not want to be the brother who came in swinging at the first suspicion. Instead, I asked my father for access to the bank portal so I could review things. He hesitated. That alone told me a lot. He had always been easygoing with me. This time, he acted like he was worried about insulting somebody. When I asked who he was worried about, he said he did not know if Eric would appreciate me stirring things up. I remember just sitting there for a second. That was the moment I understood there was more than money at stake. Eric had somehow positioned himself between my parents and the truth. I knew then that if I was going to figure this out, I needed to be patient, so I started documenting everything. I created a folder on my laptop for screenshots. I printed bank statements. I wrote down dates, withdrawals, account changes, and every time Eric had been present. I even started keeping a notes app list of things my parents said out loud that did not fit with the transactions. It was not glamorous work. It was mostly staring at spreadsheets at my kitchen table after my daughter went to bed. But the more I looked, the more the pattern sharpened. Money moved out in amounts just below what I thought would trigger immediate scrutiny. Deposits into checking often happened within a day or two of Eric being there. The credit card charges matched his habits, not my parents'. Gas stations on his side of town. Home improvement stores when he was doing some mystery project on a rental property he had mentioned once. Fast food late at night. Online purchases that went to an address I did not recognize. I still needed proof, not a gut feeling. Proof. The bank was not eager to talk to me because I was not on the account. So I got my father to sit down with me and the branch manager in person. My dad looked uncomfortable the whole time. The manager was polite but careful. She confirmed that the online login had been reset several times from the same device. She confirmed that one of the password resets had been linked to a phone number that was not my father's. She would not tell me whose phone number it was, but she did agree to print a partial account activity log. Once my dad signed a consent form. I still remember the relief I felt when he signed it without argument. He was confused and tired, but he trusted me enough to let me help. That mattered. The activity log showed logins from a Samsung phone model we did not own in our house. It also showed a string of password resets and a mailing address added for paperless notices, which turned out to be Eric's apartment complex. I stared at that line for a long time. My father looked at it and went pale. He said he had never approved that change. The manager said it had been done through online banking and would normally require access to the account holder's credentials. By then, my dad was visibly shaken. He asked if the bank could just reverse it. They told him they would open a fraud investigation and place a note on the account. That was not enough for me. I wanted to know exactly how much had gone missing. I wanted to know whether my parents had been drained dry or whether we were still in time. The answer was ugly. Over 6 months, nearly $32,000 had been moved from savings into checking and then out again through withdrawals, card charges, and transfers to what looked like a payment app account. $32,000 was not the end of the world for some families. For my parents, it was most of what they had intended to use for repairs, medical surprises, and the years when they could not rely on two incomes anymore. I felt sick. My dad sat at the table with his hands folded, staring at the printout like it had personally insulted him. My mother started crying before I even explained the full amount. She asked how they were going to pay for the roof. She asked whether the furnace had to be replaced sooner than planned. She asked whether this was my fault for making her give me access. That one stung, even though I knew she was upset and not thinking clearly. I told her no. I told her somebody had accessed the accounts without permission. I still did not say Eric's name out loud. I wanted one more layer of certainty. What I did not know yet was that Eric had already noticed I was looking. He called me 2 days later acting casual, asking whether I had heard anything from the bank because Mom was worried. That wording was strange. He did not ask what I had found. He asked what I had heard. That was when I knew he was tracking the investigation. I kept my voice normal and said the bank was reviewing things. He immediately tried to steer the conversation toward me helping my dad set up a new password. He sounded too interested in the access. I said I was busy. He told me not to overreact. That was the first time I heard the edge in his voice, not panic yet, just irritation. A few days after that, my mother told me that Eric had been helping them because he understood finances better than I did. I nearly laughed, but it was not funny. Eric had declared bankruptcy once in his 20s and had bounced a few checks every year since. The idea that he was the family finance expert was ridiculous. But my mother wanted it to be true because believing Eric had been helping made the alternative too ugly. I understood that. I really did. Denial is a comfortable place when the truth makes your family look broken. I spent the next week digging through every statement I could get. I found that one of the transfers into checking had been followed within hours by a cash withdrawal at an ATM near Eric's apartment. Another had been used to pay off part of the credit card he had opened. That was the part that made my blood go cold. Not only had someone moved money, they had used my father's name to open a card and then paid it from the same stolen funds. It was almost lazy, like whoever did it assumed no one would connect the dots. I saved everything. Screenshots, PDFs, photographs of envelopes, copies of the collections letter. I even called the card issuer myself and asked for their fraud department. They would only speak to my father or someone with power of attorney, so I got my dad on the phone and sat there while he verified himself. He hated every second of it. He kept apologizing to the representative for the inconvenience. That was my father. He was being robbed and still worrying about whether he was bothering somebody. The fraud department mailed a package with transaction lists. One merchant name stood out because it was a bar and grill about 20 minutes from Eric's apartment. Another stood out because it was a tire shop. Eric had literally bragged a month earlier that he had gotten a great deal on a used SUV tire replacement. I had not thought anything of it at the time. Now it was just another brick in the wall. I wanted to confront him immediately. What stopped me was my mother. She called me one night and said Eric had been upset because I was making him look bad. She said he had told her I was going too far with the bank stuff. I asked what exactly he said. She said he thought I was acting like he had done something wrong. I asked if he had denied touching the accounts. She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the words. She said he had explained that he had helped with passwords and bills because he was trying to lighten the load. He had apparently sounded insulted that anyone would suspect him. That was a very Eric move. Turn confusion into offense before anyone can ask harder questions. I asked my mother whether she had seen him access the savings account directly. She said no. I asked whether he had ever had my father's card numbers. She said she did not think so. I asked whether he had ever been alone in the house with their paperwork. She said yes several times. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice now. She was starting to see it too, not enough to say it, enough to feel sick. I decided to stop treating this like a family misunderstanding and start treating it like a fraud case. The next morning I went back to the bank, this time with a formal fraud report drafted at home and copies of the account activity. I also brought a notebook with a timeline. The manager took me seriously the second she saw the packet. She said they could refer it to their investigation team, but they would need my father to confirm that the withdrawals were not authorized. My father did. He was embarrassed and angry, but he did. That started a chain reaction I had not expected. The bank asked for a police report before they would push certain parts of the case further. My dad did not want the police involved. Neither did my mother. They were worried about family shame, about neighbors finding out, about what church people would think, about whether Eric might get arrested. I told them the choice was not really between shame and no shame. The choice was between honesty and getting quietly wiped out. That did not make me popular in the moment, but it got them moving. We filed the report. The officer who came out was middle-aged, tired, and very practical. He asked for account records, card statements, phone numbers, usernames, and names of anyone who had access. He listened more than he talked. I appreciated that. He did not make promises. He just took the paperwork and said they would look for a pattern. That evening, I got a text from Eric asking if I had gone too far. He did not say those exact words in any dramatic way. He just implied that I was causing unnecessary stress for Mom and Dad. He said if I had concerns, I should bring them to him first instead of dragging the bank into it. That was when I finally realized how much he believed he could control the story. He expected me to react emotionally. He expected me to get defensive or guilty. Instead, I kept responding in practical terms. I told him the bank had asked questions. I told him the police were taking a report. I told him if he had proof he was not involved, he should preserve it. That message went unanswered for hours. Then he called my father. I know because my father told me afterward. Eric apparently told him I was accusing him of theft. My father, still not fully ready to think the worst, called me upset that night and asked whether I had really done that. I told him I had not accused anybody without evidence. I told him I had shown the bank the statements. I told him the numbers spoke for themselves. My dad sounded drained after that. He said he just wanted the family to stop fighting. I told him I did too. What I did not say was that the fighting had already happened. We were just deciding whether to pretend. The police report did not move fast. Nothing about it did. A detective called 3 days later and asked if I could meet at the station with the bank packets. He was more interested than the first officer had been because there was a pattern of unauthorized access, identity misuse, and financial transfers that looked like internal abuse rather than random fraud. He told me that family fraud cases often took time because the evidence was spread across phones, bank systems, and personal accounts. He also told me something that stayed with me. He said the biggest clue in cases like this was usually not the money. It was the person who suddenly became very interested in controlling who knew what. I thought about Eric immediately. I handed over the copies I had made. The detective asked whether anyone else had access to the house computer or their phones. I told him about Eric helping with passwords. I told him about the password resets. I told him about the mailing address change. He wrote everything down without reacting much, which somehow made it feel even worse. After that meeting, I knew the situation had crossed into a place where I could not just keep guessing. I needed something solid enough that Eric could not wriggle out of it by saying he was only helping. The break came from a stupid little thing. My mother called me asking if I could come over and help her with an email attachment the bank had sent. She was still too flustered to open PDFs on her own. When I got there, Eric's truck was in the driveway. That alone put me on alert. He was in the kitchen with my mother and looked irritated to see me. He said he was just helping Mom with some banking stuff. I nodded and sat down. The bank email had included a link to the fraud packet and instructions to print the transaction history. When I opened it, I noticed the browser history on the computer was still visible. I do not know why I looked. Instinct, maybe. There in the recent history was a login page to the payment app tied to the transfers, and next to it was the stored browser autofill showing a name that was not my father's. It was Eric's. My heart did a stupid little leap, and then I felt cold all over. I did not say anything right away. I pretended to be focused on the email attachment. Then I noticed something else. The saved login email address matched an account Eric had used for years with a different domain than my dad's. I was not going to prove a felony in 30 seconds, but I had just found a direct connection. I took photos of the screen with my phone under the pretense of helping print things. Nobody noticed, or nobody said anything. By then, Eric had moved into the living room, probably because he knew I was there and wanted distance. I heard him talking to my mother about how the bank was overcomplicating things. That was enough for me. When I left, I called the detective from my car. I told him I had just found a browser record that tied Eric to one of the payment accounts. He asked me to email the photos. I did it from the parking lot of a drugstore down the street. The detective called me back later that afternoon and asked if I could get access to the old laptop my dad had barely used. He said he was not promising anything, but browser records and saved logins could matter. I spent the next 2 days acting normal while quietly gathering more. I asked my dad to let me back up the laptop before it got any older and failed completely. He agreed without much thought, probably because he was tired of being scared. The hard drive contained a whole mess of saved passwords and browser sessions. Not all of them were useful, but one thing stood out right away. The bank's online session had been accessed from the same device more than once using an IP that matched Eric's apartment internet provider. The detective could not use that alone as proof, but it was enough to strengthen the case. Then I found the real smoking gun. and it was almost funny how ordinary it was. My dad's old laptop had a downloads folder filled with scanned copies of bank forms, mostly from when Eric had been over helping. One of them was a change of contact authorization form from the bank. It had not been signed by my father. It had been typed up, printed, and somehow submitted anyway. At the bottom was a digital annotation showing it had been uploaded from Eric's email address as a supporting document. I had to read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. He had been manipulating the account contact info through forms and online access, not just guessing passwords. That meant this was not a one-off mistake. It was deliberate. I sat in my parents' guest room with that laptop on my knees and felt something shift in me. Not rage, not triumph, just a grim understanding that Eric had been doing this with enough intention to get away with it if nobody looked closely. I sent the files to the detective and to the bank fraud department. The bank escalated the case immediately after that. They froze the card account tied to the fraudulent charges. They flagged the savings account changes. They pulled internal logs that showed repeated password reset attempts from Eric's phone number and email. Then they gave my father forms to dispute the unauthorized withdrawals. My dad signed everything with a shaking hand. My mother cried again, but this time she was crying because the shape of the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. Eric was called to a bank meeting 3 days later. I was not supposed to be there, but my father asked me to come. He said he did not trust himself to keep calm. I did not blame him. We sat in a small conference room across from a bank investigator and a branch manager. Eric arrived wearing a polo shirt and looking annoyed, not scared. He started by saying this was all a misunderstanding. That was the last time he got to set the tone. The investigator had a packet in front of her. She did not accuse him in a dramatic way. She just walked through the transactions. The link payment account, the password resets, the address change, the unauthorized card, the browser history, the email uploads. Eric's face changed little by little as she spoke. At first he looked offended, then confused, then trapped. He tried to say he had only been helping mom and dad because they were bad with computers. The investigator asked why the helper account was in his name. He said he had no idea. She asked why the saved login came from his email. He said someone must have hacked him. She asked why the cash withdrawals happened minutes after the account was accessed from his phone location. He said that was impossible. She asked whether he wanted to continue. He said he needed a lawyer. That was the first truly honest thing he said in weeks. I did not say much during the meeting. I did not need to. The facts were doing the talking. What happened next was slow, ugly, and very real. The bank opened a full fraud investigation and referred it back to law enforcement. My father removed Eric from any future access to his accounts. The credit card company reversed the charges they could verify as fraudulent. The bank restored part of the withdrawn savings after their review, though not all of it came back immediately. Some of it had been spent on cash or untraceable transactions, which the detective said would likely become restitution later if Eric was charged. The detective interviewed Eric the following week. I was not in the room, obviously, but he later told me Eric had denied everything at first, and then claimed he had been authorized to help with administrative tasks. When the detective showed him the signed documents and device logs, that story started falling apart. What surprised me was not that Eric lied. It was how long he had apparently believed he could keep doing it with no one really looking closely. That is what arrogance looks like up close, not dramatic villainy. Just a steady assumption that other people are too tired, too trusting, or too polite to connect the dots. When Eric found out I had been the one gathering the evidence, he exploded. He sent me a long text accusing me of betraying the family. He said I had always hated him. He said I wanted to see him ruined because I was jealous that mom and dad trusted him enough to help. That part actually made me laugh, which I admit was petty. I had spent 6 months watching him control access to our parents' money while acting like I was the problem. Jealousy was not even in the same universe. I did not answer his text. I forwarded it to the detective. That turned out to matter more than I expected, because it showed he was aware of the investigation and trying to intimidate me into backing off. The family fallout was worse than the legal part at first. My mother stopped sleeping well. My father got quieter. Eric's wife, who had always been polite but distant, came over one afternoon looking embarrassed and furious at the same time. She had no idea how deep his financial mess went. She told me they had been arguing for months because money kept disappearing from their joint account too. That hit me hard. It meant Eric had not only been using my parents, he had probably been hiding this same kind of behavior at home. I felt angry for her, but also sick because she had become collateral damage in a mess she had not created. She asked me what would happen next. I told her the bank and police were handling it. I told her I did not know whether Eric would be charged or whether the money could all be recovered. I told her I was sorry she was dealing with it. That was one of the few honest conversations I had in that entire period, and it felt strange that the least guilty person in the room was the one apologizing. The weeks that followed were mostly paperwork, so much paperwork, affidavits, affirmation forms, dispute packets, insurance notifications because some of the money had been tied to a payment app purchase that looked like a fraudulent transfer. An attorney the bank recommended sat with my parents and explained that they should each monitor their credit and freeze their files if needed. I helped them set that up. We changed every password. We turned on two-factor authentication. We replaced the old laptop because the thing had become a liability. My father hated all of it. He said he felt like he had to become a computer scientist at 74 just to protect his own savings. I told him that was unfair, but true. I also told him the world had changed and people took advantage of old habits. He nodded, but he looked tired in a way I had never seen before. The emotional part was slower than the financial part. Money can be measured. Trust is messier. My mother kept asking me whether Eric had really meant to do it. I told her I could not read his mind. She asked whether he had maybe just made bad choices while trying to help. I told her the evidence did not support that. That was the hardest part for her. She had to grieve not just the missing money, but the idea that her son had not been helping at all. He had been creating a path to the accounts while pretending to be useful. She started crying over small things after that. The price of groceries, the neighbor's new car, a church fundraiser she used to enjoy. Everything reminded her of how tight things had become because someone in the family had treated their savings like a personal fallback plan. My dad was angry in a quieter way. He did not explode. He just stopped mentioning Eric unless someone else brought him up. He spent a long time reviewing old statements with me one evening and shook his head over and over, like he was trying to force the meaning to change. He told me he had trusted Eric because Eric sounded confident. He told me he had trusted me because I asked questions. That was the only compliment I wanted out of the whole mess. It also hurt more than I expected because it meant my father had understood, at some level, that the calm one in the room had been the one actually trying to protect them. The detective eventually told us the case had enough evidence for charges related to financial theft and identity misuse. I did not get every detail because some of it was still being routed through prosecutors and the bank's legal team. What I did learn was that Eric had used my father's identity to open the card, routed money through payment apps tied to his own devices, and changed account contact information so he would get alerts instead of my parents. He had also used some of the stolen money for things that made no sense if he were innocent. Payments to cover his own bills, fuel, restaurants, an online electronics purchase, a short-term loan payment, and according to one bank notice, part of a down payment on a used truck he had apparently hoped nobody would connect to the case. That was the thing about fraud. Eventually, every little convenience leaves a bruise, even when the person doing it thinks they have covered their tracks. Eric got a lawyer after that. Suddenly, all communication went through the attorney or the detective. The tone changed immediately. No more angry texts, no more guilt trips, just formal letters and careful language. That alone felt like a kind of confession. He would not have needed a lawyer if he had been able to explain the transfers honestly. His wife separated from him about a month later. I know because she called my mother to ask for a copy of something and then stayed on the line long enough to quietly say she was trying to protect their remaining joint assets. That conversation devastated my mother. She was still defending Eric in small, exhausted ways even after everything, not because she believed him anymore, because it is hard for a parent to stop seeing the child you raised and start seeing the adult who did this. In the meantime, the bank kept its own investigation moving. They eventually credited back most of the traced withdrawals, though not all at once. Some came as provisional credits. Some came after disputes were finalized. Some had to wait for the fraud case to resolve. It took months. The practical result was that my parents were not wiped out, but they were shaken badly enough that they had to change their retirement plans. They delayed the roof. They cut back on some travel they had been considering. They moved money into safer, monitored accounts. My dad started using a notebook to track balances because he did not trust himself to remember what used to be automatic. He joked once that he had become the kind of guy who reconciled bank statements like a detective, which made my mother laugh for the first time in weeks. That little laugh mattered more than the money in some ways. It meant she could still find a moment that was not ruined. As for Eric, the story did not end with some dramatic handcuff moment in front of the whole family. That would have been too neat. Instead, it ended the way a lot of real ugly things end. With lawyers, with an insurance claim, with restitution talks, with a strained silence at family events, with my parents deciding they did not want him in their house unless the visit was supervised, with one uncle saying I had gone too far by involving police, with one aunt saying I should have handled it privately, with my cousin quietly telling me he thought Eric had been sketchy for years and nobody wanted to say it out loud. People picked sides in the laziest possible way. Some wanted peace more than truth. Some wanted truth only as long as it did not inconvenience them. I learned very quickly that family members who had not been paying attention suddenly had strong opinions once a confrontation became public. That part was exhausting, but the evidence held. That was the important thing. The bank records were not emotional. The device logs were not sentimental. The transaction history did not care about sibling rivalry or holiday dinners. It just showed what happened. And once that became clear, Eric could not bully the story back into shape. The most satisfying moment, if I am being honest, was not the bank meeting or the police follow-up. It was about 3 months later when my mother called and told me the bank had completed the last major review and she could see the restored balance on the account. She sounded tired, but relieved. Not happy exactly, just relieved enough to breathe again. She told me that if I had not kept all those records, they never would have figured it out so cleanly. I told her the bank did most of the work. She said no, the bank would have taken longer if I had not stayed calm and kept pushing. That was the closest she came to saying she had been wrong to doubt me in the beginning. I let it be enough. My father thanked me in his own awkward way. By handing me an old set of tools he said he had no use for anymore, and telling me to keep them in my garage because I was the only one in the family who never pretended not to need a screwdriver. That might sound ridiculous, but I knew exactly what he meant. He was saying I was the one who dealt with things instead of hiding from them. Eric never apologized, not once. Maybe he did to his lawyer or to himself in some private version of the world where his intentions sounded cleaner. Not to us. The last direct communication I got from him was a short message through an attorney's office saying he denied criminal intent and would not be discussing the matter further. That was fine. I had long since stopped needing anything from him except distance. The family now keeps the important accounts locked down in ways none of us would have thought necessary before this happened. My parents have one shared notebook, one password manager, and one trusted contact list that includes me and not Eric. That change alone was a small victory. It was also a sad one. I did not want to become the financial gatekeeper for my parents. I just wanted them safe. A year later, things were still not perfect, but they were stable. The roof got fixed. The furnace made it through winter. My mother stopped flinching every time the mail came. My dad learned to use the bank app himself, slowly and with a lot of muttering, and I have never seen a man more annoyed by his own progress. As for me, I learned something I probably should have learned earlier. Sometimes the calmest person in the room is not calm because they do not care. Sometimes they are calm because they are already keeping track of enough to know that panic would only help the wrong person. When Eric pointed at me and told me to confess, he thought he was forcing me into a corner. He thought I would break first. Instead, I let him keep talking long enough to expose himself. That was the whole thing in the end, not some movie-style takedown. Not a dramatic confession. Just documents, device logs, bank records, and the kind of patient work that makes a liar run out of places to hide. I do not feel good about what happened. I do not feel victorious in some grand sense. My family got damaged. My parents lost sleep and trust they can never completely get back. Eric blew up whatever version of himself he wanted us to believe in. And I got to learn in the worst possible way that being the responsible one means you are often the one who has to carry the ugly truth until everyone else is ready to face it. Still, when I think about that day in the kitchen, I remember how sure he looked when he accused me. I remember how he expected me to fold. And I remember telling him to go ahead and make the call because I already knew the evidence was not on his side. That part still matters to me, not because I enjoyed watching him fall apart. I did not. But because the truth was there the whole time, sitting in the statements and the logins and the paper trail, waiting for somebody patient enough to pull it together. And once it did, the whole investigation turned around and walked straight back to him.